a big welcome. Thank you so much for joining us, taking time out of your day. It's sunny here, at least in Toronto. I'm not sure where you are, but if it's sunny where you are and you're here sitting in front of your screen, ready to listen to a really fascinating talk, then thank you. That's the ultimate compliment. Okay, let's wait another 30 seconds and then I will kick things off and we'll hear from Professor Frank Dobbin.
I'm going to jump in with a breath practice for 30 seconds.
Oh, yeah, thank you, Mike.
So as we wait for 30 seconds, now maybe 25, 24, just, you don't have to close your eyes, but see if you can just stay with your breath, perhaps for 4 full inhales and exhales at your own pace. So 1, 2, 3, 4.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Mike. Okay, welcome back. Hello, everyone. For those who haven't seen me before, my name is David Zarnett. I'm a political scientist at the University of Toronto and the Director of Research and Strategy at Starts With Me, the organization that is behind the State of Mind conference this year. So today's topic is a really fascinating one, and it builds on some of the conversations we had yesterday about race and discrimination in the workplace. Diversity training might be the ultimate buzzword these days. Diversity training programs are ubiquitous. While they do have a long history dating back to, I think, around the 1960s, since the murder of George Floyd 2 years ago now, organizations of a variety of different kinds, profit, not-for-profit, public sector, private sector, are all engaging in some way in diversity training and diversity-related programming. I think the latest estimate is that the diversity training industry is something like $8 billion, and I think that estimate comes from 2003. So you can only imagine how big the industry is today. So diversity training programs are ubiquitous, and it's a main feature of what organizations of a variety of different kinds are doing. At their core, diversity trainings are really about addressing discrimination in the workplace, creating psychologically safe environments, climates of authenticity, as we heard from Ellen in the previous section, creating a more inclusive environment, enhancing employee morale, promoting the free flow of ideas and information, promoting intergroup collaboration, and of course, promoting the hiring, retention, and promotion of candidates and employees from diverse backgrounds, especially those from groups that have been historically marginalized or underrepresented. If diversity training works as advertised, it would be a great thing for workplace mental health. It would allow employees of all backgrounds, especially those that are generally excluded and marginalized from certain professions and industries, to bring their whole selves to the workplace. They could feel like they are part of teams, they feel like they're valued, they wouldn't worry about microaggressions or other forms of implicit bias. It could really be a game changer. But as we're going to learn a bit more about today, the research on diversity training effectiveness suggests something very different, that diversity training actually can have negative adverse effects, unintended consequences, making the workplace less representative, less diverse, and potentially even more toxic. To dig into this fascinating topic, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Frank Dobbin. Frank is a professor of sociology at Harvard University. He's an expert in organizational behavior, economics, public policy, inequality. And I think he's probably the guy on diversity training efficacy. He's with his co-author and colleague Alexander Kalev is the author of a number of really important peer-reviewed studies on the effectiveness of diversity training. His work has appeared in The Economist, in the Harvard Business Review, and he's also the co-author of a forthcoming book, Making Diversity Work. No, I didn't get that right. Getting to Diversity, What Works and What Doesn't for Every Organization, to be published by Harvard University Press. And I think it's out in, Frank, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, out in September. And I think that's going to be a fascinating read, something that that I really look forward to digging into. So I could not think of a better person to engage it with on this topic than Professor Dobbin. So Frank, thank you so much for joining us. Before I turn it over to Frank, just a quick note about the format of this session. Frank is going to talk for maybe 30, 40 minutes, whatever works best for him. And then there will be lots of opportunity for a Q&A. If anything pops up during the session, please feel free to post it in the chat. If it's a comment, if it's a question, do your best to maybe leave it to the end, and we can answer your questions then. So with that being said, Frank, let me turn the screen over to you, and thank you again so much for joining us.
Well, thanks so much for the invitation. It's great to be here. As David said, Sandra Kalev and I have been working for a while on looking at what actually happens to firms after they put in not only diversity programs, diversity training programs, but all kinds of other programs that are designed to promote equity at work. We came to this because of frustration about our experiences in examining what firms do to promote diversity over time, how they choose their practices, and then their managers' beliefs about the efficacy of the practices. We've known really since the 40s that anti-bias training programs tend not to do much of anything. There's like a segment of people who have adverse reactions to them, and the people who already are on board, often they feel slighted, and they feel that somebody's blaming them, even though they think they have good intentions. So what I want to talk about today is why diversity training programs, what the frustrating thing about what's happened with the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement after May of 2020, when George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis, the frustrating thing is that many companies have doubled down on a particular approach, and it involves diversity training to try to remove bias from people's heads, and then rules and regulations to try to prevent managers from acting on biases. And what our research shows in general, and this is reinforced by lots of other studies, we just have a particular kind of data that allows us to compare these programs to other programs. But what becomes clear in our research, both with quantitative data and in our interviews, is that efforts to change people's biases by targeting them, essentially by blaming them through anti-bias training, or by trying to change their behavior with like hiring guidelines and promotion guidelines, rules, or grievance systems that actually threaten to sanction managers who practice discrimination of any kind. These things just don't work. They just don't change the workplace. But we see a pattern of things that do work, things that practices that really change how systems at work operate. And we think that they partly change the workplace by changing the interactions between people at the workplace, mixing groups up that had normally been in many workplaces segregated in particular types of jobs. Often people in logistics are men of color, people in call centers are women of color, often engineers are Asian American men and white men. I mean, often we have kind of siloed workplaces, and if you actually mix people up and expose them to others, that's the best strategy we know of in the social sciences generally for reducing bias. So I'm going to be talking about why these kind of individualized approaches to trying to address bias have been unsuccessful, and why other approaches have been much more successful. So what I'll present a bunch of data, but I want to start with the population that we're looking at. I'm going to be talking about a sample from this population of all private sector workplaces in the United States, for which we have data from the early 70s forward. So this first slide just shows what the problem is. So for each group, we see the percent of workers from the group, the whole group in all of corporate America, every workplace with at least 100 workers, the percent of workers who are in management jobs. So I'm going to focus on management jobs today, not because everyone has to be a manager and not because they're the only good jobs, but because if a company isn't able to get people from a particular group into management jobs, it also means that they're not able to typically move people from that group, even up from frontline jobs, into the second rung or the third rung before you get into management. So it's just that we have data on all different occupations. This is sort of the best indicator of, is your diversity approach, is your inclusion approach actually working? So if you look at these 8 lines, these are the groups for which in the US there are enough people in the survey the federal government conducts of employers, there are enough people for us to analyze. So if you look at the right-hand side, which is 2018, what we see, for example, from the very bottom is that the green line is Black women at the very bottom. And what this is telling us is that about 5% of all Black women in corporate America in 2018 were in management jobs. If we go back to 1998, it was 4%. If you look at Latinx women, it's about 6% in 2018. It's also 4% in 1988. If you look at the next line is Black men, kind of violet line. That's 6% in 2018. It's also 6% in the early 1980s. And Latinx men are about 7% in 2018, and they're about 7% in 1983. So what this is telling us is that if you make it into corporate America, you have some job in corporate America, if you're a Black or Latinx man or woman, your odds of getting into management are no better than they were in the late 1980s. So I find this super discouraging. Of course, the corporate workforce is more diverse than it was then. A lot of that is just because of immigration. So there are more Black and Latinx Americans, US citizens now. But your odds of making it into management just haven't improved. And when companies look at their own data, this is what the average company sees. Some companies do better, but some companies do worse. So we're kind of stuck. And we argue that a big part of the problem is that we've just doubled down on training, even though social scientists have known for a really long time that training doesn't change people's minds. You can't train away bias. Bias is built up over years. You can experientially change biases, but you just can't train it away no matter how many hours. There are a lot of psychological studies that look at different training programs that mostly finally have very small effects, then dissipate over a couple of weeks. So we're looking at 800 companies, 830 companies over 30 or 40 years, and we're looking at all the diversity programs they adopt, and through longitudinal analysis of time series data where we have an observation of each company every year for for example, for the representation of each of these groups in management. And then we surveyed these companies and we asked them, we got a kind of life history of all these practices so we know what years they had them in place. So what we're showing in all of the subsequent slides is the same thing. Which groups see a statistically significant change after the program is put in over typically 7-10 years. We're usually able to observe them for that long. So in this first slide, this is what happens after companies put in diversity training for all employees, the average diversity training program. And we see that for most groups, there's just a marker to indicate not a statistically significant effect. There's only a negative statistically significant effect for Latinx women, but this just isn't doing very much. So I do want to make sure that you understand what's going on here, because sometimes I don't explain clearly enough. Are there any questions about what we see here? So this is the percent change in the share of, for example, Latinx women who are managers. So the share, let's say they hold 2% of management jobs, something like that. That's about right. So that declines by about 6% over the next few years. So it's not a giant decline, but they started out low, and there's a statistically significant negative effect. Mike.
I assume you may get to it or not, but I guess I'm so curious about, actually, one, I'm curious about the use of the Latinx thing, because from what I understand in the polls from America, Latino people tend not to want to adopt that term. And I'm not saying, I'm just curious what you think about that and if that relates to this. And then the other question is, how come the implicit bias, like whenever I talk to a client in terms of mental health training, they always say, oh yeah, we just did an implicit bias training for diversity, da, da, da. Like, how is it still so entrenched and so believed to be useful? It just seems so puzzling to me, which is why it's so nice to have you here helping us understand like how we got here and that kind of thing.
It is absolutely true that the Latino population on average doesn't especially like Latinx. It's pretty hard to come up with a generic term that group likes. So, I mean, it said Hispanic before this same slide, but we got a lot of pushback for Hispanic. So
interesting, right? You can't do anything right, I guess, right?
Well, no, I completely understand. I mean, basically, it's the same thing is true of Asian Americans. I mean, most Asian Americans would prefer to be called Korean Americans.
Right.
Most Latinx people would prefer to be called Cuban Americans. That is, they would prefer that the country of origin be specified. But that isn't that's not the kind of data we have. So
got it. Thanks.
I mean, to me, it is perplexing that so many places have doubled down on diversity training. I mean, especially since the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement. Just companies have put in new programs. They've hired somebody else to do it with the knowledge that it never worked before, so we'll try somebody else. So it's created a lot of new work for various diversity trainers, and a lot of diversity trainers have new clients, but companies haven't really changed their strategy. I mean, there's some sort of better news. Well, this is worse news. So this is the most common kind of training in the United States, diversity training, which is training that's specifically for managers and is about the law. And this only has pretty big adverse effects on historically underrepresented groups. So this is much more discouraging, I think, than the previous slide, because the generic, everybody gets diversity training forum doesn't do a lot of harm, but this is what everybody does, and this does some real harm. The good news is this is a very uncommon form of training, which is cultural inclusion training with no mention of the law. So this has some positive effects. Here we're seeing significant positive effects on Black men, Latinx men, Asian men. I wouldn't pay too much attention to which groups see benefits. That can have something to do with how big the sample is, for example. But in general, this looks like it's more effective, but it's not what companies are doing. If you had to do something, cultural inclusion training that avoids discussion of the law, to me, seems like the right thing to do.
Can you just explain us, can you explain, I don't even know what that, I mean, I have a sense, I think I know what that means, but what is cultural inclusion training?
Well, for one thing, the focus is not on your own biases. It's on how we manage the workplace better to include all groups.
Got it.
So this is training for managers. So the focus is on a common management issue, which is how do we make the workplace inclusive for everybody. It's not on your own bias, and it's not on the law. Companies do this in a lot of different ways, but you can certainly tell whether diversity training is about the law just in how it's advertised, who gives it. Often a lawyer gives it. This tends to be given by people from the firm who've been trained who've been trained basically at a workshop, much like the workshop you've been running, in how to communicate with other people and how to bring out their feelings and how to express empathy.
Thanks, Frank.
So regulations. So the other thing that firms do is they put in all kinds of regulations that are supposed to prevent managers, box them in so they can't practice bias. I'll just give you one example. This is job tests for managers. So companies that put in job tests for managers see significant declines in all 7 historically disadvantaged groups. And you might think that that's because those groups don't do well on job tests for managers, but these tests are quite standardized, and it's not true that the people who take them for management jobs from these groups do worse on the tests than white men do on the tests. The groups do approximately equally on the tests. I mean, as a population, groups that are highly educated tend to do better on these tests. The white women and Asian men and women tend, on average, to be more highly educated than white men. What's going on here is that managers tell us when we interview them, somebody's trying to force me to choose who they want for my team rather than to choose who I want for my team. And so I'm not good with that. I'm not doing that. So they ignore the test results. Just high, and this indicates that they do more than ignore the test results. They resent the implication that they're biased. The other couple things that firms do is they put in civil rights grievance procedures that are supposed to reveal and help to fire managers who are biased. Here we see only adverse effects. When we interview managers, they are very angry when a grievance procedure has been put in because they feel like now any decision they make can be challenged. Sometimes they say things like, I know one way to avoid ever having a grievance filed against me, it's not to have any people from protected categories on my staff. Mike.
Sorry, I just find this so fascinating and helpful. So can we just look at that last one again? Yeah, this is literally having the exact opposite effect than the stated desire, and we could all say good intention, right, to change these things. But what you're showing us is that it literally is having the direct opposite impact. Is that right? Am I
Precisely, and I mean we find this in our research, which compares lots of different practices, that there are many studies that that look only at the effects of grievance procedures. These are civil rights grievance procedures or harassment grievance procedures that show the same thing. Basically, people who file grievances usually face retaliation. And as a consequence of that, they often have to leave. And often their friends leave because they see, in the case of harassment, that a manager has harassed somebody and that the procedure didn't fix the problem. And so they get frustrated and leave.
Right.
So, but you're exactly right. So these are the things that firms have, these are the go-to things that firms do to try to address discrimination and harassment by focusing on what's wrong with individuals in the workplace, and they just don't work. But there's good news. So I guess the big picture is that the things I've talked about so far are really popular, and they seem to mostly have adverse effects. So that's bad news. But the good news is there are a lot of things that have positive effects. It's just that they're not very popular. And I think that's what we need to do, make them more popular. So one issue is that recruitment of new employees is not really democratic. And by that, I mean, companies don't equally try to find people from all different groups. So they typically go to large public colleges and universities, for example, that often enroll relatively few people of color. In the United States, relatively few companies go, for example, to historically Black colleges or Hispanic serving institutions. They don't really recruit democratically. Often they go to the alma maters of existing managers, and since most existing managers are white men, they end up at schools full of white men. Another problem with recruitment is in many firms, most recruitment is done through informal referrals. Like you put the word out that you need a new person in the finance department who has an accounting degree. And who refers people through these informal networks? It's usually existing managers who are, as we saw at the beginning, mostly white men. So firms can do two things to change this. They can do targeted recruitment where they specifically send their own managers out to historically Black colleges, institutions that serve indigenous peoples, institutions that serve Latinx people. And this has pretty strong positive effects, just sending managers out. And when we interview managers, they say, yeah, I just had no idea there were all these great fill in the blank people from this group who were getting accounting degrees. Who knew? And then they have a connection at that college or university to an accounting professor they can call up the next year. And what's impressive about this is that these are changes that persist over 10 years. We see in our data at least 10 years. So this isn't just like a one-time thing where there's a blip. And this is the effect of putting in a referral incentive program. So that makes the informal referrals that usually come from top managers, it makes that process open to everybody. So a frontline worker from a different group who's not a white man can refer her cousin too. And we see both of these things, the effects of both of these things are about doubled in companies that use employee resource groups. So groups that are usually organized by identity group that use employee resource groups to boost the effects of the recruitment programs and the referral programs. So once people get in, they need mentors. And the problem with most mentoring programs, well, on the one hand, a lot of companies don't have formal mentoring programs. And when you don't have a formal mentoring program, the people who get mentoring are the people who look like the current executives team, which in most companies is white men. And that's because people are more likely to voluntarily come forward and say, I'll be your mentor to somebody who looks like them. So companies need to have formal mentoring programs. But another mistake that companies make, a lot of companies have tried to solve this problem, not by putting in a mentoring program for everybody, but by putting in a mentoring program for what they call high potentials. So these are people who are nominated by existing managers to join the mentoring program. And sometimes the high potential programs are specifically for people who are underrepresented. But those programs only net people, that is proteges, who already have somebody who's rooting for them. So those programs have become super popular. And it's true that that in big companies where they put this program in for like the cream of the crop, the 1% of people who they think they can get into top management, sometimes top management becomes diverse more relatively quickly. But that isn't the real solution. The real solution is a wide open mentoring program. So here we see the effects of mentoring programs. Note the scale is a bit bigger. So in general, so most groups see positive effects. And here I'm just showing you mentoring programs in chemicals and electronics. In some sectors like retail, mentoring programs can't bring people from cashier to store manager because the store manager has to have a college degree and the cashiers don't. But here are two industries where a lot of people have college degrees. So a mentoring program can actually bring you from not management to management. And here, if you see the size of these effects are huge compared to everything else we've seen. These are hugely effective. And a mentoring program, you get assigned to be somebody's mentor. You don't choose them in these programs. And the mentors we talk to will tell us, well, I met this person and she was just incredible. She was a coder. I didn't know that we had Black women coders who were this good. These are white guys usually talking. And I just made sure that she got every opportunity that anybody in my department would get. I just made sure that she got on the list when they were looking at promotions, for example. So you can see how these programs would not only solve the quantitative problem of you have a lot of people without mentors, but also start to change managers' minds, because we know that the best way to change managers' minds about bias, to change people's minds about bias, is through experience. So through experience with a protege. Interestingly, some studies show that these mentoring relationships also change the minds of the proteges, thinking this organization is not as biased as I thought it was. Maybe there's a future for me here. I'll just show you one slide about training. Basically, training programs also within firms tend not to be democratic. So training is a part of the career system, but in many firms it's offered informally. So your supervisor, if you're a cashier, might take you aside and show you like how to do payroll, because they realize there might be a supervisor job open. There might be a job on the night shift open. So they, if you're buddies with the supervisor, they might take you aside and show you how to do some things. Where there are formal training programs for managers, usually you have to be nominated by your supervisor, and people tend to nominate other people who look like them unless there's a specific program for that. So if you have in a firm that has a management training program, having a special nomination procedure and allowing self-nominations, both of those things have proven to be quite effective. I want to show you something else though, which is cross-training programs. So these are programs where people come in and they move around to learn how the firm works. They move around to different jobs in different departments. And here we're seeing very positive effects on most of the historically underrepresented groups. And when we talk to people, interview people about what's going on here, they say, the people who go through the rotational training say, yeah, they put me in HR when I came here. That wasn't my idea, that was their idea, but I know how to code. I have a community college degree in coding. And so they moved me around, and I started in HR, but a month later, I was poached by the finance team who needed a coder. So cross-training programs have like the advantage of they expose people in different groups. Before I mentioned that a lot of jobs are kind of segregated. Minority men, for example, in logistics jobs. This gives people exposure to departments that are full of people that aren't like them. So in a lot of firms, I mean, I find this effect pretty impressive, because a lot of firms only do this for a certain number of jobs, not all the jobs. Like they'll do it for mid-level engineers and above or something. So a lot of companies have informal work-life support. So if you're the right-hand person of the CEO and you have twin newborns, whatever you need, anything to keep you on and to make sure you come back. But if you're somebody in the mailroom who hasn't been there that long, a person of color, the same situation, you may not get any flexibility. So we see that firms that both put in formal work-life support programs and try to train managers in how to use them so that managers understand that they're really for everybody, they see big effects. So this is the effect of putting in a flex time policy. And I think what's interesting here is when we talk about work-life programs, people are always saying, yeah, that's for white women. What do we do for everybody else? Well, look who benefits from these. Everybody does. One of the reasons minority men benefit is that minority men and women tend to be in dual career couples where they both have to help with childcare. Neither person can afford to quit because they tend to have lower incomes than white couples. So anything that can make it possible to be a good parent, any kind of flexibility, keeps people from quitting for a job that's closer or a job that has more flexibility, or a job that has different hours that works better with their spouse's shift. So these policies don't cost anything. I mean, this just means you can flex your hours, you just have to apply. Most executives tell us this doesn't cost anything. And in fact, a bunch of companies have done their own self-studies and find that this doesn't cost them anything. Mike?
Thanks, Frank. Sorry to interrupt. I just, Jenna I was wondering the same thing, but I think I answered it in my head, but I could be wrong. Why do many of these have negative effects on white men?
Well, in some ways, this is a zero-sum game. Like this is, if one group goes up, another might have to go down. So here we have 7 historically disadvantaged groups seeing gains. There's a loss for white men, but white men still in these firms have a disproportionate number of the jobs. It just means really that these other groups are able to stay around long enough to be considered for promotion.
Right. And is it in some sense, this is the equalizing of the field that we're all aiming for in this sense, right? Like the idea is to balance this out more. And it's currently so unbalanced that it's inevitable that you would see a decline in the white male dominance in that role. Is that right? Kind of?
It can be. I mean, this is all proportional. Another thing that firms see when they are able to retain people longer is their performance usually increases. And so they often grow. Deloitte found this in the 90s when it started promoting women. It had this huge growth phase, and the CEO said, you know, the only way we could grow was we were keeping people around, keeping women around and making them partners, so we had more people who could take on big projects. Right. So, I mean, it's sort of a zero-sum game, but I think a better way to think about it is, if you make this a better place to work, the company just succeeds. And so this isn't really, this is just changes in the percentage of management jobs. Right. But of course, if management has grown because the company has become more effective, because more people have been working there for 3 years and not 6 months, turnover is just a huge cost in so many companies, you know.
Yeah, thanks.
This is parental leave policy. So these are unpaid leaves. And this is having a big effect on several groups. And this is childcare referral program. So this is just, usually big companies have a vendor who helps them help their employees find childcare. This doesn't cost much of anything. I think this is really a signal that if you have a new baby, we want to try to help you figure it out. We want you to stay around, come talk to us, talk to your supervisor, because this, I mean, you can look up the local child care services pretty well on the internet. So I mean, I deliberately showed you 3 things here that don't really cost much of anything. This is unpaid leave policy. Paid leave policy has a bigger effect. So, I mean, companies ideally would do more, that is, they'd pay. The last thing I want to talk about is trying to get managers better on board. So I'll just show 2 slides. It can help to have a diversity manager in place. These are all pretty big effects. And when we interview diversity managers about what they do, they say, you know, I can't tell them who to hire. I can't tell them who not to fire, but I can come around after the fact and say, why? What happened there? And that seems to be a big part of what they do. They make line managers self-reflective about their decision processes. They make them think more slowly. And so in some ways, this is the best slide, because this is a diversity task force. And what is this? It's a group of managers. Usually the CEO asks heads of business units or departments to join this voluntarily. Normally they meet every month, every quarter, and they look at the data and they try to figure out where the data are going. So if you remember my first slide, they're looking at data that looks like that in most companies. They're looking at data that are flat. And if you want to see that, go to any tech company. Now, most tech companies have been posting their data for 10 years now. It's not pretty. They're not making any progress. But in general, when companies get these managers together and ask them to look at the problem, look at the data, come up with solutions, and then try again next year if nothing's changing, it works. And also, when we talk to managers who've been on these task forces, like the first thing they say is, oh my God, the first time I saw the data, I couldn't believe my eyes. Why did nobody tell me this before? Well, companies don't share their data with the whole workforce because they don't want people to know how bad things look. But if you get on one of these committees, it seems that a lot of managers who, like, we'll hear a manager will tell us, for years I said, this company is a meritocracy. If you're good, you get ahead. Day after I saw the data, I said, oh no, that's wrong. I had that wrong. So also diversity task force. You're using your own people to try to essentially retain the people you hire and hire a more diverse group of people. I mean, that's money well spent. And these are not outside consultants. The solutions are within the firm. So this just summarizes what I've been saying. If you have diversity training, your legal counsel will tell you you can't get rid of it, but you can at least rethink how you do it and try to do it in a way that won't backfire. Regulations, I mean, these rules, grievance procedures just don't seem to stop bias. Trying to stop individual level manager bias, it's just not a winning game. But we see that trying to democratize recruitment, mentoring, development, that is training and work-life programs, those things can really work, and putting managers in charge of the change process has been really effective. Thank you. I probably went for longer than I should have.
We kept interrupting.
But thanks for the questions along the way, Mike.
Yeah.
Great, Frank. Thank you so much for that. That's really, I had read some of your articles, but that was shocking, seeing some of those effect sizes for the different strategies. I would love to hear from some of the audience members what they thought, their reactions to seeing those slides. But maybe as people sort of formulate their questions in their own mind, one thing I'm curious about is, if you were an HR professional, now knowledgeable about the effects of these different strategies to promote diversity within your organization, what would you do to promote a mentorship program, childcare referral programs, flex time policies, all the things you're seeing that have a positive effect on diversity? How would you sort of pitch that within your organization, given the sort of the orthodox position now, or the widely held view that diversity training is the way to go? We need, as you said, we need to hire an external consultant. How would you go about sort of pitching these alternative, more effective strategies that seem to be just less popular?
Well, I would start by putting in a diversity task force, just to get managers involved in coming up with the solutions. It looks like it really matters if managers themselves are looking at the data and then devising the solutions. It matters because it gets them involved in making sure the solutions get put into place. So if you take mentoring, for example, we often hear that there's a mentoring program, but people don't sign up for it. So people don't want to be mentors, they're too busy. So, but if you have a task force that's put it in, it means you have a manager from each division, each department, each business unit, who can go back and say, hey, sign up for this. And they're going to be accountable the next quarter when the data come out and nobody in their department is signed up to be a mentor. So I think one of the problems is that HR can't really lead this. HR can kind of corral people and towards some solutions, and they can inform people about what the research says. I mean, a lot of HR managers are now coming to researchers like me and saying, what should we do? You know, is this going to work? Which I think is helpful. There's a ton of research out there, but there's been a sort of disconnect between people in industry who are trying to lead the change, and then this huge body of research that gives you some idea of what might work and what might not work. You know, I have to say, when we talk to companies, Sandra and I, for example, about the work-life effects, there's nobody who doesn't leave the room and say, oh, yeah, we need to expand the flex time program. Oh, we need to think about how we could do that. There's nobody who doesn't think that they've got to do more on the childcare front, if only to message that we're going to talk to your supervisor, solve the problem, you know. And I think what's striking about the pattern here is a lot of this stuff does not have to cost much money. Right. So companies could do this even in scarce times. Right. And that's been one of the problems with the diversity programming in general. Often stuff disappears when times are tough.
That's something I was actually going to ask, whether the negative effect, whether there's like sort of an industry effect, if diversity training just doesn't work for some kinds of companies, but it might work for others, like a subset of companies. So should the HR professionals in the audience think about your findings in the context of their own industry? Might there be situations where diversity training, as commonly practiced, it does work, or no? Is it for every kind of organization across every sector of the economy?
The legalistic diversity training for managers that's now common, often they'll say it's implicit bias training, but it's half that and half the law, what you're not allowed to do as a manager. That doesn't work in any industry we look at. Of course, we separate the industries and see if they differ much. I'll say that the cultural inclusion training pretty much works in all industries, but for instance, in customer service facing industries, it seems to work better. So for example, in healthcare, where the goal of the training is not to just train you to deal with other people in the workforce, it's also to train you to deal with patients and their families. And it seems that in customer facing industries, the cultural inclusion training works better, because also hospitality, because it is focused on the business as well as just the workforce. But it works in all industries. I mean, I showed you the main difference across industries, which is for mentoring, where in some industries it works better because everybody's college educated, so it's easy to move up into management.
Right. So just a note to the audience, if you want to share your own experiences trying to get different diversity initiatives forward, the challenges you've faced, the obstacles, feel free to either to put in the chat or to raise your hand and express your experiences to us. That would be great. Frank, I'm wondering if this is an American story, right? And how does this translate to maybe the Canadian economy, where, maybe presumably we think differently about minority groups and race? Is it possible that diversity training might work in Canada, but just doesn't fit the American economic culture? Is that something that HR professionals need to think about, the differences between Canadian and American economic culture?
It's a good question. I mean, without doing a study like ours, it would be hard to know exactly. Right. But I think we can see a pattern where anti-bias training, which is, I mean, from what I've seen, most Canadian companies do some sort of implicit bias training. It doesn't seem to work because it basically says you're biased and the problem is you and you have to fix that. And people just don't respond well to it. They don't respond well to that message or to the message that we're just doing this to comply with the law. Right. So I don't know, do you feel in the Canadian context, in diversity training, people get the message that this is about legal compliance?
I don't know.
I would love, I know a lot of people have a hard time talking about these things as well, because it's not as generally, these discussions just aren't as open as ideally we'd want them to be. So I know some people do hesitate to even know how to ask certain questions. I do. One thing I wanted to point out was that, and I think it's with the moving people around departments, or just that I know to reduce stigma for mental illness stuff, exposure to people with mental illness is generally the best way of reducing the discrimination or the stigma. And it's the same across cultural groups, as I understand, or I think
absolutely, yeah.
I take that right. And so it seems so, I try to remove the labels from my own experience. And just as a human being, to be in a room full of people and have anyone singled out for an assumed bias, right? Or to be told what they think and why they're bad and why they need to be better and et cetera, et cetera. Just it's so backwards. But we've just seemed to, that's just the status quo. And I part of the psychologist in me says, is that our sort of left brain logical need control, need outcome to sweep it under the rug to soothe our angst? I don't know what the word is. Angst.
Angst, yeah.
Yeah, I just need to check off a box because this is such a hard conversation to have that if we just go for the off-the-shelf product, which is the implicit bias training, then I can check the box and move on. And then what happens that you show in that data is over 20 years, nothing has changed. But so then it's like we double down on it or something as opposed to being more open. It's a huge problem, obviously. And like nobody, well, I shouldn't say nobody. It seems difficult to find these discussions. And it's like, okay, yeah. And I'll just stop talking. It was a bit of a rant. I don't know if that was a question, so I apologize for that.
Useful rant.
Yeah, Brad, go for it.
Yeah.
Frank, this is a great session, and thank you so much for sharing such insightful data. One observation that I'm making, or at least one thing that's coming out to me, and Mike, it's kind of in tandem with the question that you asked. What came across to me, Frank, is some of the trainings that you spoke about, right? The bias training and so on and so forth. It's almost like it increases the fear of what I could do wrong and how do I see it from a legal standpoint.
Yep.
And the cultural inclusion training, the way I see it is it actually focuses on what could we do better versus what can we do right? Because in that piece, there's, as human beings, we try to make things black and white, good, bad, right, wrong, and so on and so forth. But I sometimes find we make more progress when we ask the question, what could we do better sincerely? What could we put our efforts sincerely towards doing a little bit better tomorrow? And that tends to usually yield a slightly better result. That's what's coming across to me and observing. Is that a fair observation, Frank?
I think that's exactly right. I mean, as some of the people we interview put it, about the conventional anti-bias training. Yeah, I came away with a list of things I'm not supposed to say and a list of things I can't do.
Right.
And I'm going to have trouble remembering them all. So, whereas the cultural inclusion training, I mean, a lot of times it's sort of a toolkit, like if, here are some things you could try. Here's a way you could open a discussion with your subordinates. Here's some solutions when you think, for example, there's harassment going on in your workforce. And a lot of times people come away like they're asked, especially when these are live sessions. Obviously, the switch to doing all this stuff online has probably subverted most of the positive effects of cultural inclusion training, but people are often come away with an action list, and then in follow-up meetings they're asked to go through and talk about how their action list worked out, whether the strategies they had come up with for the problems they identified in their own work groups worked. So that's such a different approach to, here's what you can't say, here's what you can't do. Don't ask women if they're married. Don't ask anyone if they have children when you interview them. I mean, that's just like, that's not going to change people's biases or their ways of thinking about the world.
Right. That's very
Brad, sorry, Brad.
No, I was just saying that was really insightful.
Well, Brad, thanks for that contribution. And Frank, we're right up against the clock. I think the only thing that I would be very curious about is who is doing it right? Who are actually those companies and what characteristics do they have that have led them, say, away from the more counterproductive diversity policies towards all the positive ones that you outlined? What makes them unique? Who are they? How can we learn more about what they do and maybe understand a bit better about how some of these policies can be rolled out or practices can be rolled out organizationally?
Well, a lot of companies have done things well over the years. IBM is one of them. Xerox has done a good job of moving away from this kind of accusatory, the problem is with our managers approach to how are we going to change the culture. Deloitte is another one. I mean, it's easier to give examples of older companies because a lot of the companies that have been established in the last 10 years are in tech, and their numbers just don't look very good if you look them up. And now they post their numbers. But all of those companies created mentoring programs, they created task forces to solve the problem, they looked at the data, they came back to the data and tried to figure out what they were doing wrong. So they reevaluated their initial strategies, and they didn't outsource it. I think one of the problems with this industry, the diversity industry, is it's just too much outsourced. And there are some really great people out there, but you need people within the company to think about what the problems are and to try to fix them and to live with them.
So internal champions of diversity, not just the instant right. Okay. Well, Frank, thank you so much. This was great and really enlightening. I'm really looking forward to reading your book, Getting to Diversity, What Works and What Doesn't for Every Organization, coming out in September. Thank you again for joining us. This was a really great session. And to all the participants and attendees, thank you so much for attending. And I hope you took something out very meaningful from this session. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you, Frank. Thank you so much again.
Frank.
We are back at 1:30, so feel free to take a break and re-sign in for a discussion with a series of HR professionals who will be talking about their work on the front lines. So see you in half an hour.